We have gone through 3 panels thus far. We started with procedural justice this morning at the point of contact between police and immigrants. We moved into social justice, looking at collateral effects on families and communities. Criminal justice, looking at the larger context surrounding rhetoric and enforcement actions. And finally, we're going to move the lens back even further for this current panel, which is, though it's entitled Economic Justice, it might more properly be entitled Political Economic Justice, or maybe an even broader contextual title, because it's really just an attempt to pull back the lens and look at the context that surround immigration and the kind of enforcement actions that you have seen, especially in the last few years. And I'm going to turn it over at this point to our discussant on this panel, Monica Varsanyi, who is a professor in the political science department here at John Jay and at the CUNY Graduate Center.
First of all, hello everyone. I and this panel are the last thing standing between all of you and a glass of wine. So we will, of course, be fascinated to hear all these papers, but we'll also stay to the time. I want to thank Dan and Shirley, first of all, for organizing such an excellent conference. It's been a really, really wonderful day, so thank you. So let's stick with a 15-minute per paper rule, and let's just get started. I think first up is Jenna Loyd from Syracuse University, and she will tell you about her title and so forth. Thanks.
Can everybody hear me? Is that okay?
Yes?
Closer. Okay. No? All right, I'll speak. Thank you to Monica and to Dan and Shirley and to everybody for being here on this toasty, warm afternoon in New York City. Let me get my PowerPoint. As we've heard this morning, Immigration and Customs Enforcement runs the nation's largest detention and supervised release system in the United States, confining over 33,000 people on any given day in a complex archipelago of large and small jails, public and private contract facilities. The remote geographic locations of many of these facilities and the transfers within the system are issues of real concern for anyone who's tried to track down a loved one, to post bail, or to serve as a legal advocate. Remoteness itself compounds the unfreedom and harms of detention, making remoteness itself one of the most frequently criticized conditions of the entire detention system. In 1986, only 5 years after mandatory detention for asylum seekers had been re-implemented, the system's daily capacity stood at just over 2,000 people. Detention itself and such a rapid expansion are not inevitable, and they require explanation. After all, the feds at this time, they built up this detention and transportation infrastructure in a governance context in which popular and government support for hardline enforcement of the law, however unjust and materially challenging to do this, it has coexisted with popular and government support for shrinking the state. So this is a contradiction, an apparent contradiction, that subcontracting arrangements often aim to resolve in the name of efficiency or expertise. Furthermore, given the notoriously fickle local support for prisons and detention facilities, explaining where it is that the feds built and located facilities is another part of this puzzle, which I'm going to focus on here. And it's one that has particular relevance as ICE seeks to build what it is calling a truly civil detention system. So today I want to share with you how we, and by we I refer to my co-author Allison Mounts, how we arrived at the following conclusions. So first, explanations of detention's remoteness that rely on contemporary U.S.-Mexico border narratives, of which we've heard some today already. They neglect the importance of late Cold War geopolitics, and specifically in the Caribbean. So we've already started hearing some of this story in the previous panel. Second, ahistorical and placeless explanations obscure the importance of shifting military and prison geographies, which is to say military-based conversion in the context of the Cold War and end of the Cold War, as well as prison expansion, which is to say mass incarceration. So third, the problem of remote conditions of detention is tied up with mandatory detention itself, and that is also then to say the very expansion of detention as a system. So the findings I'm presenting today are sort of the very beginnings of a book that I'm writing with fellow geographer Allison Mounts on the history of the development of the U.S. detention system from 1980 to the mid-1990s. And my portion or my research is part of a comparative international project led by Dr. Mounts, which is investigating islands as important sites where struggles over migration, asylum, and sovereignty transpire. So in this broader project, understanding how remote locations of detention have become a tool to both deter migration and foster removal is one of our objectives. So then in asking where is remote, this is a question of history and a process of how places are made remote in relation to other places. And I'm not going to go into our methods, but I will let you read them. So there are many explanations for the remote locations of detention, from proximity to the border, to entrepreneurial county sheriffs and prison corporations, to dislocation from favorable legal jurisdictions, or more favorable, we should say. So while each of these may be important at certain times and places, no single factor can explain the dynamics of rapid expansion from the early 80s. Further, many of these explanations rely on geographic frames or imaginaries of the US-Mexico border as a dangerous and uncontrolled space, which overshadows local law enforcement and geopolitical dynamics. So this map that I'm showing you from the report that Commissioner Schiriro mentioned earlier this morning, and its use of these classic traffic light colors depicts so-called detention demands that threaten to engulf the interior. And you might notice it even threatens Mexico and even into sort of spreads into the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. So the blurring together of these administrative data create the impression of borderness to the sites of apprehension and removal, even though border field offices like San Diego and El Paso, I don't list out the data itself, but if you look at the report, so the border field offices like San Diego and El Paso are not listed among the top apprehension offices, unlike non-border offices like Atlanta. So this map then doesn't so much explain apprehension and detention dynamics, which is to say then local law enforcement issues, nor the site locations of detention facilities, as act as a form of what a geographer colleague of mine, Mark Monmonier, calls a cartographic fog. So we decided to pursue a history of the present detention system using 3 regional case studies: Batavia, New York, which is near where I live in Syracuse, Florence, Arizona, and Oakdale, Louisiana, through which to trace the scramble for detention space even before 1996. And that new round of net widening and expansion at that time. So the story I want to briefly tell you then about the contemporary detention network is far more centered on the Caribbean and the intersecting Cold War dynamics of militarization and criminalization of migration than the current focus on border narratives of the U.S. that rely on U.S.-Mexico border narratives, or focus on private prison lobby would suggest. So Dr. Martinez brought up the Mariel Boatlift. So let me show you and tell you a little bit more about the Mariel Boatlift. It was a pivotal moment spurring the Immigration and Naturalization Service's reinstitution of immigrant detention. So it's worth remembering that at this time, the Border Patrol operated short-term holding facilities for removal, but the INS did not operate long-term detention. The Mariel crisis, though, unfolded most intensely over a 6-month period of time, during which 125,000 Cubans arrived in Florida. During the boat lift, Carter and Castro played a high-stakes game of chicken with other people's lives. Despite deepening discontent in the US about the spontaneous arrival of people who did not have family ties or were convicted criminals, Castro bet that Carter wouldn't risk the image problem of rejecting refugees who were fleeing from communist oppression. Castro bet wrong, and Carter actually did close the doors to Cubans, but then he reopened them, partially closed them again, all within the span of weeks. Rather than enjoying blanket admission as refugees, as they had previously enjoyed, Marielitos were defined as asylum seekers or entrants whose cases would be individually adjudicated. So as they arrived in Florida, the feds established ad hoc processing centers, sometimes using a football stadium. They also then turned to using mothballed military bases in Florida, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and even as far away as Wisconsin. Soon, Fort Chaffee in Arkansas had been effectively was a closed detention facility. So meanwhile, as this is taking place, another crisis brewed that would highlight the starkly racialized boundaries of asylum when, soon after Mariel, 15,000 Haitian asylum seekers arrived in South Florida also by boat. So although many of the 35,000 to 45,000 Haitians who had entered the US in the 1970s had received parole, by the late 1970s, the Carter administration was intent on deterring Haitian asylum seekers. So Duvalier, if you'll recall, he was a Cold War ally. The US had actually used a military base there in Cold War maneuvers in the region. And so one of the things that happened is the Justice Department implemented what it called the Haitian program, that first entailed incarcerating all Haitian males, and then they implemented mass asylum hearings in order to speed deportations. This may sound familiar to people who are familiar with Operation Streamline, for instance. So Haitian nationals then were confined at Chrome North, which is an abandoned Nike missile base some 23 miles away from Miami. So when the Haitian Refugee Center challenged the discriminatory nature of detention, the Reagan administration, by then Reagan had been elected, he implemented mandatory detention for everybody. So he said, okay, this isn't discriminatory, now everybody's now detained. So as Chrome was then filled beyond capacity, Haitians were transferred to prisons and abandoned military bases throughout the country, including Brooklyn Naval Yard for a time and Fort Allen in Puerto Rico for a time. Reagan rationalized mandatory detention as a deterrent to migration. So the INS's new detention policy aimed to create, quote, a fear of being detained in order to prevent another Mariel. They even relied on sort of climatological reasoning, I suppose you could say, as one of the reasons why they thought that this might work. So in speaking about a military base near where I live in upstate New York, one INS spokesman said, well, a side effect may be that there's been so much press about Fort Drum being Siberia that it may have caused people to think twice about migrating. So meanwhile, the resistance of Cuban detainees to their confinement and media depictions of lawlessness and drug violence in Miami, where there had just been as well the Liberty City civil unrest, further cemented the construction of Cubans and Haitians as criminals for whom coercive confinement was the appropriate solution. So when Cubans who were held at Fort Chaffee, and this is when President Clinton, was then governor, when they rioted for their freedom in 1980, many of them were then transferred to federal prisons throughout the country, and there was this very serious dispute between INS and the Bureau of Prisons over how it is that legally the Bureau of Prisons could actually confine people who hadn't been criminally convicted. So they had to sort out something to do with this situation. So in this trend then of transferring of uprisings within detention and transferring throughout the system would continue through the 1990s. So when in the early 90s then, large numbers of Haitians and Cubans once again fled from their countries, a different crisis brewed than had been the case in 1980. Detention for asylum seekers was now mandatory, and space in jail and prison facilities that the government might try to contract out was overcrowded. And many of these facilities were under court order to relieve the overcrowding, right? So in order to create another Mariel, or to prevent another Mariel, or a crisis of Central American refugees, which had also been facing Texas, the U.S. turned to a buffer zone, what it called the buffer zone strategy, to prevent asylum seekers from reaching the U.S. mainland in the first place. By the time that Clinton was in office as president then, in 1994, the U.S. was had confined 40,000 Cuban and Haitian migrants in Guantanamo, and at what they called safe haven camps throughout the Caribbean. And this map gives you a sense of the locations of Haitian and Cuban nationals over this time. So by this time then we see both an onshore and offshore archipelago of detention that spreads throughout the continent. So this largely forgotten Caribbean and Cold War roots of the contemporary detention network sheds light on the three conclusions with which I began. So first, the dominant imagination of undocumented entry along the US-Mexico border focuses on detention as a mechanism for removal, rather than understanding its use also to deter unwanted asylum seekers. And it then avoids different racialized dynamics of migration and xenophobia that is preventing Haitians' arrivals, expanded reliance on detention for all groups. Immigrant detention then is built not only on the anti-Black racism of the criminal justice system, but also in asylum policy itself, right? So this has important implications, we think, for thinking about building broader understandings of the ways in which racism and anti-immigration work together, as well as for building coalitions against criminalization. Second, ahistorical and placeless explanations obscure the importance of local military and prison geographies, as well as regionally specific detention dynamics. So we can certainly see this with the ways in which Chrome detention facility, the infamous Chrome, is still being used. But we can also see this in ways in which local communities responded to the restructuring of the military itself as played an important role in the expansion of detention and prison capacity. So in Oakdale, Louisiana, for instance, the first INS built the first system there, or first detention system there. And part of that, what ended up happening is that the residents in the area springboarded their local World War II military bases that were newly surplus into new federal revenue streams in the form of the detention facility, again against BOP wishes, and then also into regional prisoner and alien transport hub, as well as new federal prisons. The third thing I want to say then is that the problem of remoteness is tied up with mandatory detention in the entire expansion. And so I can hold off on some of those thoughts, but what I want to say in conclusion, and to bring us back then to Commissioner Schreiro's remarks at the beginning of the day, in which she talked about the ways in which immigrant detention and sort of civil detention is built firmly on a criminal system. So our results, not surprisingly, show this. And so the civil detention then is built upon the material, both the material and ideological infrastructure of the criminal justice system, as well as military infrastructures. So in their mission to create an independent or truly civil detention system, that would then depart significantly from the past 3 decades of institutional reliance on jails and prisons and on military bases. And it would entail a massive expansion of capacity, as we've now seen with the Karnes County facilities. So now, as then, implementation of national policy will hinge on locally contingent histories of economic dependence and resistance, such as we're seeing in Illinois and Florida. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenna, very much. Next up, we have Martin Schöenteich from the Open Society Institute and here at John Jay College.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for the invitation. It's great to be here. And thank you very much to you for giving my co-panelists and I your attention so late in the afternoon. I'm really grateful for that. I realized somewhat to my horror when looking through the titles of the other presentations that my title is probably the longest. And I'm not even a fan of academic jargon. So I apologize for that, and I will in a moment clarify and vastly simplify what seems like quite a complicated title. So what I propose to do is I'm firstly going to try and explain why I'm interested in this topic, mention one or two key questions which inform my presentation to, as I say, simplify this long, unwieldy title. Then compare some key US and German indicators in respect of immigration policy and immigration data. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that simply because there isn't that time to go into much detail. And then look a bit at the relationship between immigrants, immigration, and crime, partly because there are some findings which somewhat contradict what has been discussed so far today. But also by looking at it from a different angle, one sees that the issue is was more nuanced than what would appear at first glance. And it's rather important to this topic of mine. I'll then briefly describe the theories which I list behind me, go through some empirical findings which either support or reject those theories, and then mention briefly some of the implications of these theories on my topic. So, one second. So why did I first become interested in this topic? I mean, I was intrigued, I think, initially by these data, looking at a number of Western European countries, and the change in the rate of imprisonment from 1992, which is the earliest year for which the International Center for Prison Studies provides data, up to more or less 2010, also ICPS data. And one can see that for all these countries, and one could list others for Western Europe, the rate of imprisonment, as measured per 100,000 of the general population, has gone up quite significantly. Maybe not to a US-American audience, where the rate over the same time increased from 500 to almost 800, I mean, but clearly an outlier. But for many European countries, this has been quite unusual. For many decades after the Second World War, imprisonment rates were fairly stable, if not even declined in a number of European countries. So the question sort of arose, why this sort of significant change throughout most countries of Western Europe? And then I looked at data for the same countries, but looking at the proportion of foreign prisoners in these countries. And the proportion is really huge, it's significant. In many of these countries, the proportion of foreigners in the overall population is somewhere between 5 to 10%, maybe a bit above that in some exceptional cases. And yet one can see that in all these countries, the proportion of foreigners, non-citizens, is in excess of a quarter of all prisoners. In some places like Switzerland, it's almost 3/4. And Switzerland is interesting in the sense that if one looks at this data, there wasn't actually no change in the rate of imprisonment in Switzerland, which what this really means is that the rate of citizens who were imprisoned in Switzerland between the early 90s and 2010 must have declined quite significantly to make place for a huge increase in the proportion of foreign prisoners. It's maybe a bit of a clumsy term, foreign prisoners. Most European countries do not collect ethnic data, so one cannot break this data down by ethnicity, by minority groups or majority groups, but I think foreign prisoners is the best that we have to work with. So my key questions are really the following, of which I think the first one is the more important one to us, to this audience. Is there a relationship between large-scale immigration and punitive public attitudes? I think a good question for criminologists and sociologists. In other words, do societal values shift, becoming more punitive as a result of large-scale immigration? Not necessarily explicitly directed against immigrants, although that is invariably or very often the effect. And what I really wanted to know and try and answer is there a theoretical basis to even to begin to initiate such an inquiry? Are there any theories which either support or reject or oppose such a supposition? And these are the theories which I will look at in a moment. And then a second question, really more for political scientists, but I think also of interest. If there is a relationship between large-scale immigration and public punitive attitudes, what impact does it have on punitive criminal justice policies? And in my case, I'm particularly interested in comparing the US and Germany. They make for good comparisons and for a number of reasons. On the one hand, the proportion of the foreign-born population is more or less the same in both places, about 13%. But yet they have a very different approach to immigration policy. So in the US, you have birthright citizenship, jus soli, so anybody who's born in the US, irrespective of the status of their parents, automatically becomes a US citizen. That was completely impossible in Germany until 2000, until the year 2000. And even since then, it's only possible if at least one of the parents has been living in Germany for at least 8 years and has been living there legally. So quite a different approach. It's a very restrictive policy, so even after those 8 years of a parent living in Germany, it's not automatic that children become citizens. It's quite an unwieldy bureaucratic process. So that most people of foreign descent, even though they've lived in Germany for 2-3 generations now, the majority of them are still non-citizens or foreigners. So as I said, I just want to spend 1 or 2 slides on this question because it seems to me that it's maybe a bit more nuanced than what would appear to be the case at first glance. So a significant proportion of citizens in both the US and Germany believe that immigrants increase crime. More so in Germany, it seems to be survey after survey showing a majority. In the US, public opinion seems to be more fickle and change from one survey result to the next. On the face of it, it seems to make common sense. Immigrants are, generally speaking, maybe not in the US because there's a lot of emphasis on family reunification, but generally around the world, immigrants tend to be disproportionately young, male, unattached. They have lower legitimate earning opportunities and are very often part of socioeconomically deprived communities, all typical correlates of crime. Yet we know in this audience that Hispanic immigrants, for example, in the US, do not contribute to higher levels of violent crime, as was shown out just a few minutes ago. And that, in fact, might even reduce average rates of violent criminal offending. However, a recent study, and this might be an isolated study, I'm simply not familiar enough with the literature to be able to say with any confidence, says that this might not hold for Hispanic immigrants moving to non-traditional Hispanic settlement areas. A paper published in 2010 by Shihadi and Winters. And because the finding is so revolutionary, contradicting the general academic findings over the last decades or so, if you will just allow me, I just want to quote a paragraph as to why they motivate or how they motivate this finding. So they say Latinos in these new destinations, and they're speaking here about not the communities of the Southwest, but beginning in the early 1990s, looking at the Old South, across the Midwest, and up the Atlantic seaboard. Latinos in these new destinations appear to be qualitatively different from those in traditional settlement states. Traditional communities have an extensive and integrated network of social ties that was no doubt cultivated over an extended period of time. Such ties, for instance, improve the social and economic prospects of immigrants. I think that confirms many of the findings that were mentioned by previous speakers. New destinations, they say in contrast, lack the social control umbrella of traditional places. Deprived of a significant source of social capital, new Latino migrants were forced to rely less on an established ethnic community. Compounding the structural deficit within these new communities was the profound isolation they faced from other ethnic and racial groups. Now, a revolutionary finding which no doubt will have to be confirmed by others looking at the same empirical data and hopefully even others looking at these kinds of findings from a different angle using more recent and more sophisticated methods. But I think where we stand at the moment, we can safely say that generally speaking, first-generation immigrants are less crime-prone than majority populations or native populations in the countries to which they move. That seems to be the case in Germany as well, where the initial guest workers who moved to Germany in the 1960s and 70s were offending at lower rates than the native German population. Where it becomes a bit more nuanced or complicated is that if one doesn't look at immigrants in crime, that first generation, but immigration and crime, the picture changes somewhat. So in both countries, in both the US and in Germany, second and third generation immigrants, if one can call them that, it seems are more likely to come in conflict with the law than their first generation antecedents, or members of the majority group. Both income and educational gaps persist over time, and over migrant generations. There's also a lot of discrimination and exclusion, the whole range and basket of factors which can explain that tendency. So in the US, for example, 6% of fourth-generation Mexican Americans complete college compared to 35%, almost 6 times the amount of non-Hispanic whites. And we're talking about the fourth generation whose grandparents or great-grandparents made that move to America in the first place. Now, this is important, I think, for two reasons. Firstly, opinion formers, either unconsciously or consciously, populist politicians, will conflate the two, will conflate first-generation immigrants with subsequent generations and just blame it all on immigration per se. And secondly, public opinion, or members of the majority groups in these two countries or elsewhere, may not distinguish between these two. And this is especially the case in Germany, where, as I said, it's very difficult for immigrants, even of second, third, and fourth generations, to become citizens. So that native Germans might, in fact, not be able to distinguish very often between first and subsequent generations. So this tendency of second and third generations to be more crime-prone could have an impact, or may have an impact, on public opinion, either through elite discourse or through popular opinion by the general public. So these three theories, which I think inform this hypothesis that large-scale immigration might influence public punitive attitudes. One is group threat theory, which argues, broadly speaking, and I'm crudely generalizing because of the limited time, that prejudice and intergroup hostility are largely reactions by the dominant group to real or perceived threats by the subordinate group. Importantly, I think, prejudicial ideas emerge as leaders of social groups clash through public discourse on political struggle. And generally it seems to be the case that the larger the size of the subordinate group, the greater the perceived threat by the dominant group. Second theory, not at the group level but at the individual level, which supports my initial hypothesis, is at the individual level. So it's argued by subcultural diversity theorists that individuals are more fearful of people who are racially or ethnically different from themselves, often due to difficulty to understanding the culture of others. And there's some empirical data to support the link between racial heterogeneity and fear of crime. Fear of crime is typically greater where the racial mix is changing rather than when it is stable. And I think some 5 or so years ago, Robert Putnam, a political scientist, came to somewhat similar conclusion, where he found that heterogeneous populations within the US generally had lower levels of social capital, and there was general higher levels of fear amongst individuals living in those communities. On the other hand, is intergroup contact theory, which opposes the two theories which I just mentioned. And it argues, again, from a common sense point of view, that increased interracial or ethnic group exposure, the more people mix with people of other ethnic groups or racial groups, the more positive attitudes become by members of the original or the dominant group, as it were. It has also, like the other theories, a lot of empirical support, but it's a theory which is based on a number of conditions which are, in practice, not always that easy to fulfill. So for intergroup contact to really succeed, there has to be equal status within the situation. It mustn't be between an employer and an employee, for example. There need to be common goals between the different groups, as in a sports team or within the religious community. There must be intergroup cooperation, as in a military unit, for example, and not conflict to begin with. And it really helps, and I think this is a crucial point, for there to be support by the authorities, law, or custom. So if there's a general public discourse informed by elite opinion that immigration per se is negative or bad or influences crime, then it really undermines intergroup contact theory. So just briefly, I've got 2 minutes left. What do we know? There's a lot of empirical data for all these theories, especially in the US, less so in Germany, but informed mainly by relationships between white Americans and African Americans, not really so much in respect of non-Hispanic white Americans and immigrant groups, which is a gap in the literature, because what we're talking about is immigration, which could have quite a different dynamic than a historically informed and burdened relationship between white and African Americans. There's some empirical data which supports that non-Hispanic whites in the US who associate immigrants with crime are more likely to favor punitive criminal justice policy alternatives. But I think it's also important to point out that the policy impact of majority group support for punitive policies will vary from one country to the next. Just a last slide, because I have to stop. What are the implications? I think what political and social elites say is often crucially important informing the public discourse. The fear of crime, even in the context of falling crime rates, needs to be taken seriously. Fear of crime undermines inter-ethnic contact and leads to residential segregation. That's been the case both in the US and in Germany. How majority groups perceive immigrants' descendants may be crucial. Distinguishing between first-generation immigrants and subsequent generations who they should really see as compatriots, as co-citizens. And then finally, diverging age demographics between majority group members and immigrants and their descendants might also be an important factor to consider in the coming years. So the majority groups in the US and Germany are an aging population, which is getting older. Older people are generally more fearful of many forms of crime, while immigrants and their descendants are a much more useful group. So it has policy implications. Older people will vote for greater expenditure on criminal justice, for example, and not on education. And yet education is what would be important to try and integrate new immigrants into communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Next up, we have Dan Stageman, one of the esteemed co-organizers of this conference, and a doctoral student here in criminal justice at John Jay. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there with us. This piece, as you can pretty much see by the title, the focus is on locally controlled enforcement leading to detention. In a sense, what I'm trying to do here is pick up a very small piece of that context that Dr. Loyd so eloquently presented just now, and actually maybe explain in some part those apprehension and detention dynamics that she was able to lay out. Just quickly, this project draws heavily on a theory known as the political economy of punishment. It's highly contextual in terms of its theory, but the analysis itself is quite specific. We will move relatively quickly through that context because so much of it's been presented already today. But I do want to touch on a few important points, especially in terms of how I've built my model. I'll talk about the research questions. I'll talk more about my analysis. I'll talk more in terms of what the numbers mean than how I came up with them, kind of trying to take the nod from Dr. Brotherton. And even though this is quantitative work, the perspective, the roots are very much critical. So I'm trying to bridge the sort of positivist school with a little bit more of a critical perspective. And then I really want to talk a little bit about broader regional patterns and finally talk about some implications for policy and practice. I know we have still a few practitioners out there in the audience, so I'd like to see if I can give some ideas for practice with this research. So the political economy of punishment, it's an old theory. Very basic idea that every system of production tends to discover punishments which correspond to its productive relationships. This is from Roosh and Kirkheimer all the way back to 1939. Productive relationships obviously means essentially the relationship between labor and capital, between people who work and people and groups who have money, wealth, accumulated capital. Because we're using this theory, it's worth examining some of the current and historical, by which I mean pre-recession trends in both aspects of the theory. I can't spend too much time on them, unfortunately, and I do want to make it clear that I am not studying these dynamics specifically, but I think they are important to the context of this work. And I want to make it clear that the positions on this table, I'm not drawing one-to-one relationships, but we have some obvious things that are happening in terms of productive relationships in this country, from the widening wealth and income gaps to a phenomenon that I see as a disconnect between consumer and worker self-identification, self-interest. And then from the punishment side, of course, we have mass incarceration and all that implies. Where do unauthorized immigrants in the post-recession context fit into this idea, this context of the political economy of punishment in the U.S.? Well, as you can see, there's an intensification of criminalizing or othering rhetoric since the beginning of the recession, and that's been pointed out over and over again today. Othering, of course, uses Professor Jock Young's idea of constructing enemies, essentially. And you can see how these enemies have been, how unauthorized immigrants have been constructed as enemies in rhetoric, with just a couple of broad examples here. They're being constructed by Governor Jan Brewer as sort of universally, border crossers are extortionists and terrorists. There's even, recently there was even a presidential candidate on the, who suggested that summary execution at the border was an appropriate punishment for the misdemeanor crime of unauthorized border crossing. So that is obviously a major denial of personhood for the individuals who are unauthorized border crossers. In this context, we also have some broad indicators, statistical indicators that I think are worth taking a look at. Over the course of the recession, which began in 2007, you actually have a small drop in state and federal incarceration per 100,000. Obviously, this number looks different than the number that you generally see because it doesn't account for local incarceration. But you actually have a very small drop in state and federal incarceration over those 3 years of the recession from 2007 to 2009. You also have a 10% drop in the Corrections Corporation of America's occupancy rates, which represents a real drop-off in profits as well. Some of that's because new facilities are coming online at this time, and they're not having individuals to fill them, but others, 98% occupancy is much more profitable than 90% occupancy. And at the same period, you have a 70 jump in raw numbers of forcible deportations of 70,000 from an already high 320,000 in 2007. It's important to stress that these are folks that are already here and established in this country. These are not border crossers turned away at the border. So what's my argument? My argument here is that economics are a significant part of the explanation for the movement in these statistical indicators, these trends. This model lays out basically three distinct areas where criminalization or othering allows capital, allows individuals and groups with wealth to expand the benefits that they receive from the presence of unauthorized immigrants, not just in the labor force here in the United States, but also somehow economic self-interest, but that they enable these benefits, that they set the market conditions, as it were, for taking these benefits from the presence of unauthorized, undocumented immigrants. Exploitation is benefits derived from undocumented, unauthorized immigrant labor. So that's the probably main way that unauthorized immigrants are sort of taken advantage of, or that they present benefits to capital. Moving over to exclusion, these sorts of benefits here are the kinds of benefits that you would think of as benefits for the wealthy as taxpayers, benefits for wealthy individuals and groups, corporations. Generally, the idea is if you have fewer unauthorized immigrants in schools, as you would under the current law in Alabama, you'll be paying less taxes. You'll be paying less school taxes at the local level. Obviously, that has long-term implications that are not going to result in tax savings. But certainly in the short term, if you're looking at the interests of capital, then you want to shrink the tax burden. And finally, the top one, which I've called extractive othering, really just for the alliterative value of that, but is really commodification. This is a way to extract benefits that is dependent on the presence of punishment in this field. It's dependent on a punitive infrastructure. And this can be per bed, per day fees for detaining immigrants that are paid to private providers. Over 50% of beds in the detention system, we've heard this again today, are administrated by private interests. But it can also be per bed, per day fees paid to contracted local correctional agencies. So, a county correctional agency such as, was it Maricopa that was mentioned earlier, where Paul Bebeau is the sheriff? What's that?
Sheriff Boppy.
Sheriff Boppy. Okay, I like that. They're in that game. They're in the same profit-making private industry game as the Corrections Corporation of America, the GEO Group, and other private interests. And it's important here, I think, to point out that detained immigrants are much more profitable than traditional criminal justice system prisoners. The average fee paid by the federal government for a detained immigrant per bed per day is around $120 a day. Average fee for regular criminal justice system prisoners is about $40 per bed per day. So even though it's clear that immigrant detention is more expensive, the profit margins are also higher. So what I was interested in trying to determine here is, are economic factors correlated with the scale of locally controlled immigration enforcement? So basically, in order to extract profits on an enforcement level, you have to have some kind of local control. Sheriff Babot can certainly have contracts to have immigrants sent to him from New York City, from various other places around the country. But in order to have direct control over the profit potential for detaining immigrants, he needs to have local enforcement that he controls through his department, and he does. He has what 287G agreement with the federal government. If it is correlated, to what extent? So what I did very quickly is I did an analysis and specification of state-level macroeconomic factors. Factors being underlying conditions that I think are driving certain variables that I looked at for the year 2009. I looked at 3 independent factors that I thought maybe had something to do with the level of local enforcement. I looked at market scale, which is really just a broad indicator of what I thought the total profit potential a state could have for deporting its entire unauthorized immigrant population. And this is a state-by-state analysis using only 2009 data. So it's a narrow analysis, but with broad implications. The second factor I looked at was what I called punitive economy, another broad indicator of what I thought the economic involvement of the state was with prison infrastructure. So this is not just for-profit prisons. This is also intended to be a measure of how many jobs are implicated in the prison economy, broad indicator of the administrative money in that prison economy for any given state. And the third is market pressure. These are recessionary factors that are, in some sense, pushing immigrants out of the more profitable exploitation field. I think the money, it's clear that the money available in sort of extractive detention is not comparable to what you could certainly yield from unauthorized immigrants through exploitation, but where you have high unemployment, immigrants are being pushed out of the labor market. And then it's also a pull factor. It's the pulling of immigrants into empty beds where incarceration rates are dropping on a state-by-state level. And finally, the dependent variable that I wanted to look at was a measure of the scale of local enforcement, which I'll just let you take a look at in a different way. I used an average of sort of 2 or 3 variables to build each of these factors. And I used a method known as, these are just descriptives, as factor analysis, which for those who are interested in the statistics, basically you want these numbers to be higher. The size of these numbers essentially represents how much variance in these concrete variables is explained by that underlying factor. So what we have here with these 3 factors that I developed explains 70% of the variance across these factors, which means that this is a pretty good model. It holds together as a concept. Same for the local enforcement. It also holds together as a concept. Explains about 2/3 of variance across these 3 variables. And then what I had to do with these variables, since they're so, these factors are so badly distributed, basically, is rather than do a traditional regression, I took the 50 states and divided them, ranked them basically, ranked them into pentiles. So you had the top 10 enforcement states were pentile 5, and the bottom 10 enforcement states were pentile 1, and 2, 3, and 4 were in between there. And I did a ranked correlation between the 2. And These findings in some ways are unsurprising. I think it makes sense that market scale would have the highest sort of linear correlation here, which is to say that where there are more immigrants, there is more detention, there's more local enforcement. But the most interesting ones, I think, are the correlations between punitive economy and market pressure, which do show these sort of weak to moderate correlations with local enforcement. So they are exerting some influence, according to this model, on the scale of local enforcement. Another interesting one to point out, the actually strongest indicator is market pressure, but it's not linear, so there's maybe something going on there that's interesting. For those who are less numerically oriented, I have some maps that show this. They're not nearly as pretty as Dr. Loyd's maps, but I think worth looking at. The top ones for all three are the dependent variable, scale of local enforcement, and the bottom three are the independent variables. So you have some unsurprising trends there. Certainly the Southwest has the highest market scale and certainly some of the highest rates of local enforcement. But you also have anomalies like Louisiana, which has a tiny unauthorized immigrant population, but is in the top rank for local enforcement. Part of that is explained by their prison infrastructure, and I think Dr. Loyd touched upon that. They have a unique opportunity to take detainees, immigrants from Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and detain them in Louisiana and make a profit. Market pressure, as you can see, these unemployment indicators and indicators like that are concentrated in the Rust Belt Midwest. So just a brief discussion, since I've really run out of time here. Sorry. Just to look at what we see here with these indicators, there's a question here about cross-border movement of labor. Is international labor migration somehow a public harm that we need to deal with detention? I would put that up against the idea of international capital, the movement of capital across borders, which is widely celebrated. It's important to acknowledge that labor migration has mostly purely economic roots. Border crossing rates have fallen precipitously since the beginning of the recession and appear to still be falling. What are the possibilities for managed migration versus the punitive paradigm that we see right now? And finally, restrictive state laws such as the ones in Arizona, Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, is there really self-deportation going on, or are these laws simply going to set a new normal for risk and hardship that immigrants will tolerate in order to come here to work, to make money? And finally, a few implications for policy and practice that I don't really have time to go over anymore, but you can read for yourselves or follow up with me later. Thanks all.
Thank you, Dan. And last but not least, we have Hung-Eun Son here from John Jay College, Professor of Criminal Justice. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm Hung-Eun Son, and in the next 15 minutes, I'll be sharing with you some of the preliminary findings from an ongoing study on the victimization and police treatment of undocumented migrant workers in this area in Greater New York. All right, so there were 8 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. workforce in 2010, and they represented 5.2% of the U.S. workforce. These people are overrepresented among low-skilled workers employed by the farming, construction, food processing, and manufacturing industries. And among them, we can identify a subset of undocumented day laborers, or UDLs. And these are male migrants from impoverished countries who work for different employers and get paid on a daily basis. They congregate on street corners or in front of Home Depots and wait for contractors to offer them work. Most day laborers do not plan permanent residence in this country. They leave their families behind and send home most of their earnings as a remittance. day laborers eventually return to their countries of origin to reunite with their families. So it is believed that there are about 300,000 of them across the country. The movement of migrant workers respond to push and pull forces between sending countries and receiving countries. And let's take the example of Guatemala, which is a major supplier of day laborers in our area. The average personal income in Guatemala is just 6% of the average income in the US. And the high fertility rate provides Guatemala with a surplus of very young labor, in stark contrast with the aging American society. And the overall low educational achievement of the Guatemalan population also makes its labor force comparatively low-skilled. So the surplus of poor, young, and non-skilled labor is, in Guatemala is separated from the rich, aging, and educated America not by vast oceans, but by the not very well-guarded Mexico. Social and trafficking networks have long existed between Central America and the US. So therefore, the massive inflow of migrant workers from Guatemala can only be a natural consequence of these structural forces. Illegal immigration is the primary means by which America gains access to low-skilled and low-cost labor. Yet America grants only about 150,000 visas annually to temporary low-skilled workers, when we actually absorb hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of farm workers, meat packers, UDLs, and migrant women working domestic services every year. And this refusal to make our immigration control responsive to our economic needs has paradoxically turned migrant workers into a rescinded legal liability and a cherished economic asset at the same time. Therefore, we can describe undocumented migrant workers as global outlaws. They are essential to our society, but rejected as legal non-persons. They make fundamental contributions to our economy, but remain systematically excluded from our civic life, including criminal justice protection, public health care, and other public benefits. So in this study, I simply set out to know more about how migrant workers experience crime and criminal justice in the US, and to explore what public safety and law enforcement consequences have been created by the illegalization of migrant workers in our local communities. My focus will be on violent victimization, wage theft, and police treatment of undocumented day laborers. So the sample comprises of 208 undocumented day laborers from Palisades Park, New Jersey, and Jackson Heights, New York. They were recruited from street corners and consented to participate in a 60-minute long survey interview. Each one of them was given $30 for their participation. Then about 7 or 8 focus group interviews were also completed. Who are they? This sample of 208 workers averaged 35 years of age. Nearly 2/3 of them were Guatemalan of Mayan origin. About 8 in 10 were on their first trip or stayed in the US. And as a group, they averaged more than 5 years in the US and expected to return to their home country in about 2 years. What do they do? How much do they make? More than 70% of the sample self-identified as construction workers. On average, they worked 32 hours for almost 2 different employers during the week before the interview. The mean income in the past month was $1,036. And it was hard to estimate their annual income because most interviews were completed during good months in spring and summer, when there were plenty of jobs available. But knowing that winter employment can only range from none to full employment, so I estimated that their annual income should range between $9,300 to $12,400. And they kept about half of their earnings to for their personal use in the US and sent home the remaining half as remittance. That means that their typical annual discretionary income ranges from $4,600 to $6,100. And this is probably the main reason why they are not in search of permanent stay in this country. That is the amount of money that they make. It's good enough for them to feed their family back home, to send their children to school, to build houses for their families, to turn themselves into objects of admiration and respect in their own communities. But that amount of money will never allow them to raise a family here in the States. Okay, all right, let's take a look at their violent victimization experiences. More than 1 in 4 have been victims of robbery, and 15% have been assaulted since their arrival. Direct comparison with male victimizations in the general population as reported in the National Crime Victimization Survey is impossible because NCVS probes about victimization in the past year, in the past 12 months. My questions asked for their experience since their arrival to this country. But there are still strong suggestions that migrants suffer a much higher levels of violence. Let's just look at the example of robbery. So 0.2% of males in the general population were victims of robbery in the past 12 months, as compared to 26.4% of the males of the subjects in my sample who had been robbed since their arrival to this country, and their stay in this country only averaged 5 years. So there's a strong indication that they suffered violence at a much higher level. Day laborers are known to be prime targets of robbery because they are known as walking ATMs. They don't have bank accounts, and they always carry plenty of cash on themselves. They are easy targets. And then among victims of violence, migrants were much more likely to be attacked by strangers. Nearly half of the migrant victims believed the offenders were Hispanic. From our focus group interviews, we learned that these Hispanic offenders were mostly English-speaking youths from local Hispanic communities. And then, as expected, migrants were much less likely to report their victimizations to the police than other male victims in the general population. 30% thought they were targets of hate crime with ethnic motivations. Wage theft. Our findings on wage theft are in line with research reported in the past 5 years. 7 in 10 of the subjects in our sample had been victims of underpayment or non-payment of wages. Overall, a typical migrant worker experienced 5.3 incidents of wage theft per year. And the median loss per incident was $97 for underpayment and $150 for non-payment. And based on those numbers, we estimated that on average, each migrant worker lost $647 from wage theft every year, which represents 11% to 14% of their discretionary income. And then from our focus group interviews, we learned that most migrant workers see this loss as a kind of direct business cost required for their stay in the US. And then, not surprisingly, 3 in 4 of the victims did nothing to address their victimizations or to recover their losses. The main reason was because they thought nothing would work. They simply did not believe that the system would address their grievances. Police contacts. 4 in 10 migrants had had non-traffic encounters with the police since their arrival, which seems somewhat more frequent than among males from the general population, as reported in the Police Public Contact Survey conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Again, the use of different time windows makes direct comparison of contact prevalence impossible. More contacts were initiated by the police, and fewer were started by the migrants themselves. Yet still, 48% of the migrants who had encountered the police had initiated the contact. It appears that there wasn't too much fear of the police among the group that I interviewed. When compared to other police citizens encounters, police were more likely to use force and coercion against migrants to search them, and to arrest them. Migrants were much less likely to be in police contact involving criminal investigation, and they were often asked to provide their personal information, including their immigration status in these contexts. An unexpected finding from focus group interview is that despite our statistics, migrants shared a very positive image of the American police. Although some had witnessed incidents of police harassment, they tended to think of American police officers as respectful and professional. A main explanation for this was because they judged American police by comparing them with Mexican or Guatemalan police they knew in the past. And American police scored much higher in their eyes. Okay, so the current control of migrant workers has had some negative public safety consequences. First, it has turned undocumented migrants into suitable targets of crime. These walking ATMs and objects of public contempt are prime targets of robbery and assaults. Second, the illegal status of migrant workers has created enormous incentives for legitimate businesses and private families to engage in wage exploitation of migrant labor. Third, the policing of migrant workers is characterized by surveillance and containment. Officers maintain frequent contacts with migrant workers without actually providing additional protection or services. Frequent contacts with the police did not result in lower victimization or higher crime clearance. From the perspective of political economy, both the victimization and policing of undocumented workers served as social disciplines that reinforce the subjugation of migrant labor in our society. They remind migrants of their place in this community and keep them under close monitoring. Judged by their effects, both the victimization and policing of migrant workers effectively contribute to the maintenance of a cheap and subservient unskilled labor in this aging and ever better educated America. To conclude, an hypothesis can be formulated. The civic status of migrant workers is inversely proportional to the impunity for crimes against them, and directly proportional to the fairness and effectiveness of police services among them. That is, the fuller migrants' membership in the community, the less crime they will suffer. The fuller their membership in our community, the more just and equal will the police behave. The civic status of migrant workers can be partially enhanced by local practices such as empowering them through the establishment of worker centers and unions, or we can implement a more aggressive enforcement against wage theft. But ultimately, the civic status of migrant workers is determined by our national immigration policy. Probably the best way to optimize the civic status of contributing migrants is to tailor our immigration control according to our economic reality, so that the level of legal inclusion is proportional to or reflective of their economic inclusion. And immigration policies that turn vulnerable groups into crime victims and create incentives to corrupt our business and citizens are harmful to the rule of law and well-being of our community. And I think we should definitely do something about it. Thank you very much.
All of the papers in some form or another speak to this trifecta of punishment, profit, and place. And of course, I would like to point out the obvious, which is something that we've mentioned today already, which is that punishment and profit are really mutually constitutive here in the United States and elsewhere, where we rely pretty heavily upon an undocumented labor force and extract people's labor while at the same time rejecting them as sort of full human beings within our society. So each paper in turn, let's see. Jenna's paper does a really beautiful job of highlighting the really place-specific histories and geographies of punishment as detention. As she points out, it's really impossible to understand the current state of detention, where we find ourselves today, without tracing that history back through the Caribbean migrations of the latter portion of the 20th century. As she does point out in the paper, and I don't remember, I think you mentioned this today, although it's definitely in the paper, most often people think about the US-Mexico border as sort of the highlight of detention practices now, but her paper with Allison really points out this Caribbean history, which is very, very important. Simultaneously, she also points out the very important place-specific dynamics of detention and how the prison industrial complex really builds upon local histories and local political economies to, to feed this sort of continuing detention dynamic that we see happening today as people repurpose military bases, as communities lobby for prisons to be sited in their localities and so forth and so on. We also have Martin's paper, which surveys the literature that explores the constitution of profit and punishment from a different perspective. In Martin's case, he takes a look at this he basically surveys the literature that looks at the way large inflows of migrants have, or whether they have or have not, pushed forward sort of a punitive attitude in the societies that are receiving these migrants. Of course, while profit is not necessarily as directly obvious in his paper, it does come out in other ways. In the German case, obviously, the quote, unassimilable migrants that were reacted to were the Turks. And they were originally, as you all probably know, invited to Germany in times of labor shortage in the 1960s and thereabouts. But as Max Frisch's famous phrase goes, quote, we asked for workers, we got people instead, right? People, we want the labor, but we don't really want the full person. So, and of course, in the US case, we see much of the punitive energy being focused on Latino workers as well as others. And in the US case, it obviously happens at all scales of government. So we have punitive policies being enacted at the local level, the state level, the local, the county, the state, and the federal levels. But as Kitty Calavita and others have really shown so eloquently, these migrant flows are far from an aberration, and in fact, the enforcement mechanisms that are generated by perhaps this sort of energy that Martin's looking at are very much part of perhaps the regulation of labor in these societies. So on the one hand, like in the Bracero program, which is what Kitty Calavita's famous work looks at, we have the INS, which at the time she was looking at the Bracero program, so it was the INS, really turning a blind eye during times of harvest so that the harvest could get done. And of course, this still happens to some extent today. And at the other time, when there's economic difficulty, pushing, cracking down and becoming more punitive and becoming more deportation-oriented. The question for Martin really is, as he moves forward, perhaps he already has moved forward in his research, I'm not sure, but to operationalize his contribution to this particular debate will be very interesting to see how he sort of does this comparative case study between the United States and Germany, which are really interesting case studies to compare. Dan's paper quite obviously demonstrates another element of this punishment and profit dynamic, one that emerges in the growing context of state and local involvement in immigration enforcement. So as Dan talks about, as the federal government has sought to increase its reach, and plenty of people have talked about this today too, local law enforcement agencies have been acting as this force multiplier, or what was the phrase used earlier on, the net widening, yes, net widening, exactly. The net being used to capture, quote unquote, those workers that are considered deportable under the current circumstances. And as Dan shows, obviously, in his paper, he aims to demonstrate how some localities are jumping into this detention bandwagon. I mean, can I put it blandly, to make a buck in some ways, right? I mean, I know that you're not trying to make such a simple connection between those two things, but that's kind of an underlying tension that you see in your work, which is very, very interesting. Dan and I have talked about this before, but one thing that I've asked him to sort of consider, his analysis is at the state level, and I think if he, at some level, also takes a look at sort of local histories or local data as well, sort of city data or county data, he might nuance further his argument about the connections between profit and punishment, or perhaps further nuance the relationships that you see happening between the states and localities, because state-level data, of course, is demonstrating something slightly different than you would get from local data or county data when it comes to these enforcement practices. And last up, then, we have Hung Un's paper, which, again, clearly demonstrates this connection between punishment and profit and the advantages that can be gained by the disciplining of vulnerable workers. Echoing Abel Valenzuela's nationwide surveys on day laborers, Hungen finds in a local context here, in this place, that migrant day laborers in the New York area are equally vulnerable to predations such as assaults, wage theft, and though it wasn't the case so much in your research, but certainly in other instances, predations by the police force, police intimidation or abuse. And in the absence of organizing day labor centers, these workers are really, truly at the bottom of the occupational ladder, perhaps typifying more than anybody else this dynamic that I think many of these papers have spoken to, which is labor without any strings, labor that we can extract from without any, unfortunately for them, without any ties to sort of the broader society. I think that's what this sort of system aims, I don't want to functionalize it that much, but focuses its efforts on. So I will leave it with that. I don't want to take up any more time since we're running close to the end of the conference. But are there any questions for these panelists?
I was particularly interested in Professor Sung's focus on day laborers. I've been paying some attention to exactly the sorts of things, the exploitation, the wage theft, the assaults among day laborers in eastern Suffolk County, New York. But I'm curious to know whether any of your respondents spoke about the way courts handle cases that they do bring, because in my experience, the employers often get off even when a fairly strong case is made for the wage theft that has gone on by them in the courts, and prosecutors are very reluctant to bring forward assault cases. And that's, of course, it's partly because it's very difficult then to get witnesses. If the boss has hit the worker, in the case I've observed, and broken his jaw, and many other workers saw, and the other workers are all undocumented day laborers, they're very reluctant to testify. So it's partly that, but it's also a kind of, it's an example of a very negative courtroom work group, as we study in criminology, where I think the judge and the prosecutor and the police are all really complicit in this disciplinary program. I'm just wondering if you've had any reactions from your respondents about the courts and the prosecutors.
Okay, of those workers that I met in those focus group sessions, none of them were able to push their case beyond police reporting, so it's pretty sad. 3 of them reported their victimizations to the police. Another 3, with the help of some other people, reported their victimizations, wage theft victimizations to New Jersey's Department of Labor, I guess. But none of them were able to recover anything or see the offenders punished as an outcome of the process. That's all I can. And I have 280 people in the sample, right? And it's pretty sad.
That suggests to me that the courts and the prosecutors are really participating in this. I mean, if there's no access to the justice system beyond the police, that's a further reinforcement of this kind of exploitation.
I think that's a valid hypothesis. I don't have data to validate that.
There's still time. If I could just throw in a comment about that as well. Just in the work that I have done as well on day laborers, and this speaks to one of the presentation earlier today too, by somebody who I think might have left. When there is a welcoming context in a community, particularly when the local community has made it very clear and advertised to local immigrant communities that there is a law against wage theft, if there's a law against wage theft, that's the if, then there are cases that do go forward and are successful. But that's sort of a proactive effort by the police and by the community leadership to let immigrant communities know that. And that doesn't happen, obviously, in that many places. So it does happen, though, but not that often. Pradine?
Just a quick also in jurisdictions where the immigrant community is aware of the U visa and aware that the local law enforcement will certify the U visa or that the prosecutors will certify U visas, that provide some encouragement for migrant communities, for undocumented communities to actually report crime and for witnesses to come forward as well, even if they're not going to receive it. So that just sets up one of that, a welcoming climate for that.
You had a question?
Yeah, I must confess I'm not a sociologist, and I found it difficult to follow the meaning of the question of Martin. So if you were to summarize what was the topic in simple language of a person who's not a sociologist, how would you put that over? What is your topic, really?
I mean, the essential question is I'm trying to ask is whether large-scale immigration into Western democracies results in more punitive attitudes by the publics in those countries, especially the majority groups of the native population, as it were. I had a secondary question too, whether that public opinion translates into official policy. I think that's probably yes. I mean, it's fairly easy to answer, but it'll vary a lot between countries. So in the US, it's a much more populist system with elected prosecutors and police officers. I think public opinion plays a much stronger role. We also have a lot of local democracy in the US. In Germany, that's a bit more removed. Academics, elites play a much stronger role, somewhat detached from the public in making policy. So the big question is rather, does large-scale immigration make the publics in those countries more punitive? There are a number of theories, but they go both ways. I mean, two of the theories, one a group-level theory and an individual-level theory, would argue, yes, theoretically one can make an argument that publics become more punitive. But then there's a third theory which says that might not be so, that the more immigrants and newcomers you have, the more likelihood or chances there are for majority groups or native populations to interact with them. But the conditions for good interaction, for friendships to develop or for bonds to develop are fairly restricted. They have to sort of meet as equals, as it were. And that's made difficult by a number of different factors.
Just a quick comment on Martin's work, if I may. I mean, I think maybe to me even more interesting, Martin, than the answer to the research question, which I don't know, I feel like is probably yes, is the way that operationalizing that question is going to give you insights into the mechanisms by which these punitive attitudes are manifested in sort of in popular culture by the native populations themselves, but also in policy. So I think it's a great question to ask, even if we think that the answer is a foregone conclusion, which obviously it's not, but that may be the sort of common sense thought. Whether it is or not, it's an amazing question to ask, I think.
Laura?
Hi, my question is for Jenna, whose paper I really enjoyed. Jenna, I really appreciated that you brought in directly this issue of anti-Black racism. And so often I think that these discussions we have about criminalization of immigrants sort of sets up, certain ideas that draw from sort of problematic ideas about the racialization of, urban spaces, for instance, urban underclass, quote-unquote theory, ethnic enclaves, et cetera. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you guys have thought about, how bringing in white supremacist ideology, how we need to think about that in terms of the themes of today's conference.
Sum it all up.
That's a little question, Laura. That's a really good question, and I think that part of how it is that we've even been trying to understand the ways, and part of why I talked so much even about militarization to a degree, is that even trying to understand the ways in which incarceration and war making go together. So we typically have this story about, say, border security that very much builds upon a post-September 11 narrative, and the sort of racialized, the ways in which different groups of people have been racialized since then. This is we've been living through that, and it's been particular groups of people. But also forgotten within those narratives is the sort of longer history of anti-Black racism and the sort of connection with, the long-time connection with punishment and anti-Black racism that get forgotten. And I think that telling that longer history, and precisely then also tying it to a Cold War narrative, Cold War understandings around asylum. So it's an anti-Black racism in terms of punishment, but also in terms of asylum seeking that we have to understand and I think consistently get forgotten. So immigrants are within sort of dominant narratives, and I'm not necessarily talking about those of us in this room, but within dominant narratives, it's very much tied with anti-Latino racism, and also very much tied with anti-Muslim racism. But migration isn't thought about in terms of African migrants, and it's oftentimes not thought about in terms of Caribbean migrants. Now, this is being said within an audience in New York who are more familiar with this dynamic, but in lots of places where I've lived in the States, that's not a common understanding around the sort of racial dynamics of migration. And so I think that going back to the question of there's some real regional specificities and historical specificities of U.S. racial formations and trying to understand how white supremacy articulates in different historical moments, but also in specific regions that I think is really important for us to remember as we try and understand what are the detention dynamics right now, or how it is to oppose criminalization in general as a sort of net widening for all different kinds of groups of people. So I hope that speaks to some of that.
We're more or less out of time, but if Dan would like to offer a final thought and perhaps conclude the day.
Sure. I've just done nothing but talk today, but we as academics love the sound of our own voices. I just wanted to extend a little bit what Jenna was talking about. She had a great slide. I actually took a look at her slides yesterday that we didn't see today because we ran out of time, which actually shows and correct me please if I'm wrong, the capacity versus the demand of detention. And it's a classic map, and it reminded me somewhat of the map of what I was calling punitive economy in my work, because you see a very large concentration of basically available bed space in the U.S. South, in the states of the old Confederacy. That is not where the demand is, but it certainly is where the bed space for detention is. And if you want to look at historical trends, the sort of functional the functional flexibility of punishment as a way to respond to changing labor conditions goes back, to post-Civil War, convict leasing, in the post-Civil War context, in Reconstruction, where you had a changeover of the prison populations in the South from essentially exclusively white to essentially exclusively black. And that is simply because that became the mechanism to control African-American labor that was no longer under the control of the slavery mechanic. The same sort of flexibility I think you see in the way that detention is now being used, not just to condition an exploitable labor force, but also to make direct profits. I mean, convict leasing implied direct profits for the states where it was put in place and for the private business interests that were involved in it, and so does detention. So it's a very flexible way to respond to changes in labor dynamics, but it is also based in racism, and it's based in racist ideologies, and I think that is important to acknowledge, and I think I would thank Laura for that question.
Sure. Patricia.
I really appreciate sort of these historical connections to, sort of the situation of migration now. and detention and deportation with the historical incarceration of African Americans in the different institutions that have racialized and politicized that particular community. And I would say that, you know, in my own work, I'm trying to make those connections, but I think it's also important not to lose sight of the border and that border narrative. Because when I was hearing all these presentations today, I'm like, wow, you know, the border has moved to the interior, as many activists on the border have pointed out. And I didn't hear that connection being made. And so the conditions, the egregious conditions that we're hearing today are things that people at the border have been sort of enduring and sustaining for generations. And I just hope that that doesn't get lost in this discussion, that it's like this is something that people have been going through, you know, before the 96 law, right? And so, yeah, I just wanted to make a shout out for the folks who are organizing around and have been organizing around these issues at the US-Mexico border. So anyway, that's my point.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time. Dan, would you like to wrap up here?
The only way that I'm going to wrap up is to say thank you all so much for your endurance in making it to the end of what has been a very long and very involved day. And your reward is drinks and a reception in the president's office, which is right here on this floor. So if you'll take a right out of the door here, continue on till you can't continue on anymore, and then take another right, you'll find yourself in the president's office. Thank you.